Televiziunea Română, întâlnirile JTI și Fundația Art Production vă recomandă Garantat 100%.
Salutare! Bine v-am regăsit la Garantat 100%. Invitatul nostru din seara asta s-a născut în ianuarie 1944. E un medic și un autor cunoscut și apreciat în toată lumea. E specializat în medicină paliativă, în studiul traumei, al dependenței și în studiul dezvoltării copiilor. Cărțile sale au un succes imens pe întreaga planetă. Cititorii din România îl cunosc în primul rând datorită volumelor Minți împrăștiate, Originile și vindecarea deficitului de atenție și Pe tărâmul fantomelor înfometate, prizonier în lumea dependenței, dar și din celebrul film documentar Înțelesurile adânci ale traumei. Acum ne bucurăm de o nouă apariție editorială de excepție. Deși a apărut la sfârșitul anului trecut, vânzările au depășit orice așteptări. Când corpul spune nu. Costul stresului ascuns. O carte impresionantă, absolut impresionantă, apărută la editura Curtea Veche în traducerea Adrianei Ionescu. Le mulțumim prietenilor de la editura Curtea Veche pentru mijlocirea acestui interviu. Doamnelor și domnilor, suntem onorați să-i spunem bun venit la Garantat 100% doctorului Gabor Mate. Good evening from Bucharest. Good morning in Vancouver, Dr. Mate.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much. It's a privilege to have you as a guest in our show.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Mate, at the ground floor of the impressive architecture, which is your book, there's a fragment, and the fragment says like this: when we are stopped in learning how to say no, our bodies learn to say that by themselves. End of quotation.
Yeah.
Can you please cut some light into this?
Yes. So human beings need to have boundaries. They have to protect their boundaries. And the boundary means that nobody gets to use me or exploit me or abuse me. And that when I have a strong feeling that I don't want something, I should be able to say so.
Mm-hmm.
Now, universally, the first word that children start using repetitively is the word no. Around 1.5 years of age, you ask a kid, do you want a dinner? No. Put your shoes on? No. Now, there's a reason for that. Because before we can say yes, we have to be able to say no. If we don't know how to say no, our yeses don't mean anything at all. Now, the child has two essential needs. One is for belonging, for attachment, for connection, because without that, the child doesn't survive. The young child is helpless, dependent, needs to be taken care of. So attachment is an absolute need. But we have another need, which is to be ourselves, to know our emotions, because our emotions are there to protect us, and to be able to express our emotions and to be able to act on them. Now, in too many families in this world today, when children express their genuine emotions, their anger and so on, the parents can't accept that.
Yes.
The parents are scared of the child's anger. The parents want the child to comply. They want the child to be who they want the child to be. And then the child, because they have to belong, they have to attach, they suppress their authentic selves in order to belong. So they forget how to say no. And they take on too much. So they don't protect their boundaries anymore. Now here's the thing. The mind and the body can't be separated. The human organism is designed so that our emotions and our physiology are completely one unit. Unfortunately, Western medicine, the medicine I was trained in, doesn't recognize that unity. So we tend to see things only biologically and physiologically, whereas our physiology is very much affected by our emotions. So when children suppress their no, they're actually suppressing their immune system and they're affecting their nervous system and so on. And that's where disease comes from. So what I'm saying is that disease is actually a way of the body saying no when a person didn't say no. So when I talk to people, and I've talked to many people from Romania, actually, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, cancer, autoimmune disease of all kinds, the commonest characteristic that they share is that they don't know how to say no. They keep working to fulfill other people's demands and to satisfy other people's expectations, and they don't know how to listen to their own emotions. So that's what I'm saying. When we don't know how to say no, the body will say no instead in the form of some kind of illness.
You know, Dr. Mate, and you know this for sure. Obviously, you know that. In our culture, when you say emotion, when you pronounce the word emotion, sometimes this is received, interpreted as something not very serious. When you say emotion, emotion doesn't matter. You shouldn't be emotional. You should be self-possessed. You should be calm. You should be very yourself, but rational.
Yeah. Yes. So this is turning things on upside down. Because how human beings evolved is that the emotions came first. The rational intellect came only second. In fact, the rational intellect was constructed on the scaffolding of emotions. So there's emotional systems that we share with other mammals. We have a system for rage. We should have a system for rage, because if somebody enters my boundaries and threatens me, I should have rage to protect myself or to protect my young ones. We have a system in the brain for caring, for loving. That's essential, because without that, the young creature just doesn't survive. We have a system for lust. Obviously, without lust, there's no procreation, there's no new generations. We have a system for seeking, for exploring. We have a system for fear. We should have a system for fear.
Yep.
Because without fear, we get into trouble. We have a system for anxiety and grief, panic and grief. So we have all these emotional brain systems, and we had them before we had rationality. Other animals have them too. So the rationality came along as an evolutionary development much later in the game. And unless the rationality is connected to the emotions, it's not really rationality. It's a disconnected rationality. So in human development, the emotional part of the brain, the right side of the brain, develops before the rational left side of the brain. I'm talking about in not just historically, but also as each person is conceived and born, the right side, the emotional side. So the rational brain is then based on the scaffold of a healthy emotional brain. If that emotional brain is not healthy, then you have rationality that's completely distorted. And in the Western world, we put all the emphasis is up here. Yep. I'll tell you one more thing. We think we have a brain up here, and we do have a brain up there, but we also have a brain in the heart. The heart is a nervous system, and so does the gut. So really, we have three brains. And when the three are connected, then we are grounded. When we're only coming from up here, we're totally disconnected from reality. You can see this in politics. People can have all kinds of beliefs that have nothing to do with reality because they're not connected to the heart and the gut.
Sometimes when we talk about three brains, or scientists in general will tell you that this is something which is not serious. The brain is the only one which is here in the head. This is not science when you talk about three brains. What would you answer?
Well, then they don't know the science. It's not. I'm not making this up. The heart has a nervous system. There's a science that studies the nervous system of the heart. It's called neurocardiology.
Yep.
The gut sends more connections to the brain than the brain sends to the gut. When we talk about gut feelings, well, let me ask you this question. I often ask this from audiences. Have you had the experience of having a strong gut feeling about something,
Obviously.
ignoring it, and then being sorry afterwards that you ignored your gut feeling?
Yes, definitely, yes.
Yes, that's because the gut feelings are telling you about reality. So these scientists, they don't know the science.
Dr. Mate, there's a thought which is wandering in many of our minds, and this thought sounds like this: I'm sick because I'm guilty. And sometimes there are even medical doctors who will tell you, you're ill, but you deserve this because your behavior was bad, so you deserve this. It's devastating when a medical doctor tells you that.
Yeah. And there is a danger that in what I'm saying, people get that kind of a message, which is not the message that I intend. Now, let's take an obvious example. Somebody smokes and they get bronchitis.
Yep.
Well, clearly, there's a link between the smoking and the bronchitis. So you might say, you're guilty. You caused your bronchitis. But why did the person smoke? And in my book on addiction, I talk about this. People smoke because it soothes their brains. Why do their brains need to be soothed? Because they were traumatized. So that the smoking or the drinking, they're not because somebody decided to make themselves sick. They're because somebody needed to escape from some very difficult emotions and they didn't know how else to do it. That's because they were traumatized. So I don't blame anybody for any disease. Now, when I say to people, you have multiple sclerosis because you have been suppressing your emotions all your life and you've been too nice and you haven't known how to say no, I'm not blaming anybody because not saying no and suppressing their emotions was how they survived their childhood. It's not a conscious decision that they made. It's not like they woke up one morning and they said, I'm going to suppress my emotions. I'm going to not say no. No, that not saying no and that suppressing of the self was how they survived their childhood. It's how they survived their childhood trauma. Later on, that same adaptation becomes a source of illness. But they're not guilty. They didn't do it deliberately. They didn't know they were even doing it. On the other hand, if you're diagnosed with multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis, and I know people in Romania who've been through this, and you realize that it's not just a physical, biological, isolated, unexplainable event that happened to you, but it's a consequence of your trauma and your emotional life, then you can take responsibility. You can change it. You can change how you relate to yourself, and that can change your disease. So there's no guilt, but yes, I'd like people to take responsibility. That will help them get better.
And to make it very clear, you didn't say, and you never say, you should drink, you should smoke, because this is blowing up your guilt. You never say that.
I'm not saying, by the way, I never say to anybody what they should do. I just say, here are the consequences of what you do or what you don't do. But all I'm saying is that even if somebody drinks or somebody smokes, I don't blame them for it because there's always a reason, which has to do with emotional pain that they're trying to soothe. So why should I blame them?
How can we define stress? We should do that because regardless of the culture, regardless of the country, in most cases, we will hear these words. Yours is not at all stress. You don't know what stress is. I know what stress is. That is not stress. What is stress, Dr. Mate?
Well, so stress is basically when something that you need, you're threatened with the loss of it. Now, stress in itself is not a bad thing. For example, if I were to threaten you right now, I can't do it. I can't threaten you too much because we're thousands and thousands of kilometers away from each other. Right. But if I were to threaten you right now, you should be stressed. So stress is a physiological response to a threat. So if I were to stress you, your heart rate would go up, your muscles would get tighter, and you get ready to fight or to escape.
Yep.
Exactly. So that's a good thing. And in order to allow you that to happen, there has to be a physiological stress response in your body, which would have to do with many factors, but ultimately the release of the stress hormones, cortisol, and adrenaline. And so that's a good thing. So short-term stress is simply a physiological response to a threat. But then there's chronic stress. Chronic stress, short-term stress, and the stress response can save your life. But chronic stress can threaten your life because those same stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, that in the short term help you maintain your existence, in the long term thin your bones, ulcerate your intestines, make you depressed, put fat on your belly so that you're more likely to get heart disease, and they suppress your immune system. So you might define stress as either short-term or long-term pressure on the organism. And if you look at the research on stress, the triggers for stress are lack of information, uncertainty,
and losing
loss
control,
of control, loss of control, and conflict. And I have to say one more thing. If I were to stress you, but you weren't all by yourself, but you could ask for help from somebody, that would help to relieve your stress. So human connections relieve stress. The more isolated people are, the more stressed they are. And that's why people who, and in the modern world, there's an epidemic of loneliness. People are much more lonely than they used to be, even a few decades ago. And so when you're lonely, you don't have the same capacity to resolve your stress. And so lonely people, they get sicker faster and they die much faster of their disease. So you have to put stress not just in an individual context, but in a social context.
Dr. Mate, can one experience deep stress without being completely aware of that?
Yes, if early in life you had to suppress your, and this is what happens in trauma, is you get disconnected from yourself. You don't even know what you feel anymore. I mean, look, for me, for decades, people ask you, how are you feeling? And I get angry. I have no idea how I'm feeling. I knew what I was thinking, but I didn't know what I was feeling.
Yeah.
I was disconnected. Why was I disconnected? Because as an infant, so many terrible things were happening that the way I survived was to disconnect from my feelings, because the feelings were unbearable. If I'm disconnected from my feelings, then I don't know that I'm stressed. But that doesn't mean that I'm not stressed.
Yep.
So a lot of people are very stressed and they don't know it. Not only that.
Is there a stress of existing? Because you talk about this stress of existing, about an inherent stress. And in your own words, it's very painful to be ourselves. End of quotation. Which is the core of this pain of being ourselves?
Well, it's only painful to be ourselves if other people don't accept who we are. If people accept who we are, then it's joyful to be ourselves. For the young child, it's very painful to be themselves if the environment doesn't see them, hear them, accept them, value them, celebrate them for exactly the way they are. Then it's very painful to be themselves. So I need to clarify that.
Yep.
And then life becomes a search for oneself. A lot of people, it takes them decades to find themselves again. And it's very joyful when they do. But I've forgotten what the other question you were asking in connection with this. What was the whole question again?
The whole question was that there must be a root, there must be a core of the pain of being ourselves. Which is that core of the pain of being ourselves?
Oh, it's only what I just said. That if we're ourselves and that threatens our relationship with the people that we're connected to, it's very painful. And a lot of people can't stand that pain. So they'd rather take on the beliefs and the values and the behaviors and the expectations of their families, of their society, of their culture, than to say, no, that's not me, that's not what I feel, that's not what I believe. I'd rather be alone than to be connected in a false way. Most people can't stand that pain. Most people can't. Anywhere in the world. And unfortunately, we do that to our kids too often, that we make it very painful to be themselves.
In your own words, you question yourself, which is a rhetorical question, and you say, why are parents so unable to see the pain of their children? End of quotation. And you obviously refer to the inner pain of their children. Why the parents don't see that pain, Dr. Mate?
Because they don't see their own pain. This is multi-generational. So that when I was a young parent, and I have 3 adult children now, often I behaved in ways that really hurt them. I didn't mean to hurt them. It wasn't my intention. I wasn't even aware that I was hurting them. But that's because I hadn't understood and felt my own pain. So it has to do with one generation after another, unwittingly, without meaning to, passing on their pain to the next generation and not even realizing that they're doing it.
Dr. Mate, there's a triad, which is emotion, stress, illness. I will come back to emotion. We were talking about emotion at the beginning of our meeting. But please let me ask you a little bit more about emotion, because often we have a deep misunderstanding of this idea, of this concept. What is emotion, as a matter of fact, Dr. Mate?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? It's a word that we use all the time, and it's so hard to define it. But emotion is mental state that's associated with the physiological state in the body. So if there's a lot of tension and aggressive energy arising in my chest and in my face and my head, I'm gonna call that emotion anger. And if there's an opening and a softness and a gentleness and a tenderness in my body when I'm looking at another person, I'm gonna call that love. So I would say emotions are mental states associated with physiological states.
You also talk about emotional competence. Please define that.
Yeah. But fundamentally, I mean, in the book I talk about it at some length, but fundamentally, emotional competence is being in the present moment and responding to what's happening in the present, not determined by some past event or some past experience. And it's also knowing what I feel in the present moment and being able to express that. So very often in my life, I'd get all upset about something. And I think I was getting upset about what was happening in the present. But actually, afterwards, I realized, no, this is some past stuff that's arising here. I'm not in the present moment at all. So emotional competence is knowing what I feel in the present moment and being able to act on it in an effective way, but not confusing the present with the past.
Dr. Mate, may I kindly ask you a very personal question?
Sure.
You should be a person immensely loaded with an unimaginable burden of the shadow of death, as you have seen and been the last companion for many people before they passed away. How do you cope with that?
Well, okay, I understand what you're saying. Thank you. So yes, I did work in palliative care, and I looked after a lot of dying people. And we have this, there's a word called thanatophobia, fear of the very concept of death. And in Western society, we're very death phobic. Now, we're all afraid of dying. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about we're afraid to even facing death and talking about death.
Yes.
And most traditional societies are much healthier that way. So in Mexico, every year they have the Day of the Dead, and they go have picnics and at the graves of their loved ones, and they dance and they eat. You know.
We also have this in Eastern Europe as well.
Yes, I know. And in Eastern, you have such traditions, and you have traditions of mourning. You know, there's in Ireland, they will come and keen and chant for days. The Jewish ceremony of Shiva, where people sit with the bereaved, you know, for a few days. Every culture, every healthy culture, understands and accepts death. So when I was working with these dying people, it was a wonderful education, because you realize, intellectually we know this, but you realize experientially that death is just another aspect of living, that in itself, it can be beautiful. Depending on who's experiencing it and how well accompanied they are on that dying journey. So my own experience as an infant, and as a Jewish infant in Hungary, and you know the history there, and somehow the effect on me was that somehow I could face that darkness, and I wasn't afraid of it. I'm not saying I'm not afraid to die, but death itself is a concept. I wasn't afraid of it. And as a physician, I knew that these people, I'm not going to save their lives. So my job is to help them die as comfortably and as peacefully as possible. And that's a beautiful calling. So I didn't have a problem with it. In fact, I found it very inspiring, actually.
Let me please move a little bit into a different direction.
Yeah.
Dr. Mate, what is the physiological ground of what we call placebo?
Placebo?
Yeah.
Yes. So placebo is when you give somebody a medication that has nothing in it, or you perform a procedure but you're not really doing anything, but the patient thinks that they're getting something, or that something is being done. That's placebo.
Is that a physiological ground for this?
Yeah, yes, there's a physiological ground for it. So that, let's say you give somebody 100 people a tablet. Let's say they're in pain, and you give them a tablet that has nothing in it. It's totally inert, placebo. About 25% at least, maybe even more, will experience pain relief. It's physiological, because the very belief that they're getting help will release chemicals in their brains called endorphins, which are the body's natural painkillers. So it's not just an imaginary effect. What we believe can very much change our physiology. Well, let me tell you an amazing example. I once had a patient with so-called multiple personality disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's called dissociative identity disorder in English. So this person actually had these multiple personalities, maybe a dozen of them. And she was an adult, very well functioning, very intelligent, very capable executive. But sometimes she believed, or she went into the persona of a 6-year-old little boy. Now, that kind of mental disorder is always based on severe trauma, that the trauma is so severe that the personality has to split itself into pieces in order not to feel the pain. But here's what I was going to tell you. This woman was asthmatic, so I gave her medicine for asthma, a liquid that she would drink, theophylline, that would open up her airways. One day she phoned me, and she's got a little boy's voice, and she's having symptoms of side effects of too much theophylline in her body, of like she was almost overdosing on the theophylline. Why? Because when she was in the little boy mode, her physiology changed to that of a little boy, of a little child. So the mind actually changed the whole physiology. Now, I'm not the only one to describe this. I've seen this described by other physicians as well. That's how powerful the mind is. That's how powerful the mind is.
There's a pejorative and very harmful meaning of this usual saying, which is everything is in your head.
Yeah.
Lots of us experience this when seeing some medical doctors. And objectively, you don't have anything observable, I will say. And the doctor will tell you, oh, come on, you're very healthy. Everything is in your head. This is very pejorative, and this can be devastating. This can have devastating effects.
Oh, yeah, because the doctor is saying and what the person is hearing is that you're just imagining all this stuff.
Yep.
Which is a pejorative, and it's very demeaning, and it's very discouraging and devastating for people to hear that. But here's the thing. In a genuine sense, it's also true. Not in the sense that the person is imagining it, but in the sense that the physiological processes are happening in the head. And look, I could demonstrate that for you. If I were to, just to go back to our stress conversation, if I were to insult you right now, some insult that really hurt you, your whole body would change, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Your heart rate would go up, your blood pressure would go up, your heart, your pulses would elevate, your muscles would tighten, your stomach would tighten because of some belief up in the head. So the head has the brain has a huge impact on the physiology. So take something like irritable bowel syndrome.
Yes.
Where they can never find any physiological findings. It's all in your head. No, it isn't. What's happening in the head is having a huge impact on the physiology of the whole body. Just because I can't show it on an x-ray or a blood test or a scan doesn't mean that there's nothing happening. So really, what the doctor should be saying is not it's all in your head, but what the doctor should be saying with humility, with my limited awareness, I have no explanation for what's happening to you. Not that there's nothing wrong with you or that it's on your head, but in my head, there's not enough awareness to explain what's happening. I'm sorry. That's my own limitation. That's what the doctor should be saying.
You also talk at a certain moment in your book about the power of negative thinking. Can you please develop a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, that's a bit of a joke, because it's there's so many books out there saying just think positively,
Right.
It's nothing wrong with it. You know, just imagine yourself as being powerful, or think how wonderful you are, and you know, be grateful. And this is what they call the power of positive thinking. There are even books. There's a book called The Power of Positive Thinking.
Yep.
And so I wrote a chapter called The Power of Negative Thinking. But actually, I didn't mean the power of negative thinking. I meant the power of thinking, by which I mean the capacity to recognize both the positive and the negative. So I don't mean that people shouldn't think negatively, but I do mean that people should be courageous enough to look at what doesn't work and what hurts, and rather than pretend that everything is okay. So that's what I meant by the power of negative thinking. Really, the chapter should be called The Power of Thinking, clearly. So I was being a bit tongue-in-cheek, as we say in English, when I said the power of negative thinking.
There's also a chapter in your book that gives you shivers, and it's not the only one that gives one shivers. It's a chapter about stress, hormones, repressing, and cancer.
Yes.
It's a very scientific chapter. It's with a very, very solid scientific ground. And please elaborate a little bit on this. Stress, hormones, repressing, and cancer.
Yes. So I wrote this book originally almost 20 years ago now, you know,
right?
Not quite, but almost. Now, since I wrote that book, there's just been hundreds and thousands of more research papers pointing out the truth of what I was talking about. And when I say what I was talking about, I didn't make it up. I was already relying on the research already done by then. So 2 years ago, there was a study, 3 years ago now, from Harvard University that showed that the more symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder a woman will have, the higher the risk of ovarian cancer. And the milder the symptoms, the less the risk. Now, in that book, when the body says no, I already talked about the relationship between stress and ovarian cancer. So you can take laboratory animals, mice, and inject cancer cells into their ovarian cancer cells into their abdomen. And some mice you treat nicely, and other mice you stress. The ones with the stress, they're going to have metastatic disease. The ones who are not stressed will not have metastatic disease, will even clear out the cancer from their bodies. Why? Because stress isn't just an ideological, or I should say psychological event. It's a physiological event. And we have already talked about the physiology of stress.
Yep.
It releases all these hormones, and these hormones affect the immune system. And all the female hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and the male hormones, testosterone, which are implicated in diseases of the pelvis. For example, when somebody has prostate cancer, what do? They give them a medicine to suppress their testosterone. So same with women with breast cancer, what do? They give them medicine to suppress their estrogen, which is a female hormone. So there's a huge connection between stress and hormones and cancer. And where repression comes into it is that when you're repressing your emotions all the time, and you're not being authentic and you're not being yourself, you're stressing yourself whether you know it or not. And that stress will have an impact on your hormones. And those hormones will have an impact on your immune system and on your propensity for malignancy. It's very simple, really. It's just all connected. If you just realize that it's all connected, that it's not separable. Hormones, emotions, immunity, disease, health, it's all one system.
There's also a question that you formulate in this book. And this question is there a cancerous personality?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so it's an interesting question. There's been plenty of research that certain character traits, such as the one we have been talking about, repressing your emotions, being pleasers, trying to please other people all the time, trying to be compliant, suppressing your anger.
Yep.
These character traits do predispose, I didn't say cause, but they predispose to cancer. The more you have them, the higher risk of cancer. Now, is there therefore such a thing as a cancer-prone personality? Well, that's the question of, depends on what you think the personality is. Nobody's born with these traits. Have you ever met a one-day-old baby that suppressed their emotions? Have you ever met a one-day-old baby that won't tell you when they're angry? Try and feed them something they don't want to eat. You'll find out how connected that baby is to their anger.
Oh, yes.
You know, so nobody's born like that. But these are character traits that we develop in response to our environment. So there's no cancer personality in the sense that if you have these character traits, you're going to get cancer. That's not true. But what it is true, that if you have these character traits, you're much more likely to get cancer. Number one. Number two, these character traits are not who you really are. They're adaptations that unwittingly, unconsciously developed to survive your early childhood environment. And you can change those character traits, and changing those character traits can actually make you healthier. And I've seen that all the time.
Dr. Mate, how do you identify yourself? As a medical doctor or as a psychotherapist?
Why do I have to identify myself? I was trained as a medical doctor, and licensed and qualified,
Yep.
and I did practiced that for 32 years. In the process, because I began to see these connections, I realized that when I was talking to people about their illness, it wasn't enough just to concentrate on the physical aspects. I had to talk to them also about their emotional lives, their childhoods, their multi-generational histories, their relationship to themselves, how they felt about their wife or husband or partner, or what. So I developed these psychotherapeutic skills, which I now teach internationally. People seem to think I know what I'm talking about, so I get to teach people psychotherapeutic modalities. I have students in Romania, of course. But I'm also a human being, obviously a human being, and I have my views about the world. And here's the thing, in the new book that I've just finished writing, which will be published this year, and the English title is The Myth of Normal Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. In this book, I look at all of society, not just individuals and not just individual conditions, but what's happening. So I also have to be a thinker, a bit of a philosopher, so I just do what I do. I don't know how you can label it. But the thing is, you see, it's all connected. The social and the political and the economic and the psychological and the physiological, it's all connected. As an American physician said in 1977, we're biopsychosocial creatures. Our biology is inseparable from our psychology and from our social relationships. And by the way, in 1938, there was a lecture given at Harvard University by a doctor from Romania. He was from Transylvania. His name was Soma Weiss. And this lecture was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And he said in 1938 that emotional factors are just as important as physical ones in the causation of illness, and they have to be at least as important in the healing of illness. So you see this was said in 1938 at Harvard. And that doctor, they still have a day in his memory. But they've forgotten what he said.
Wow.
So this awareness of the unity of everything. I didn't invent it. It's been around for a long time. But as doctors and as societies, we keep forgetting it. That's what the problem is.
Dr. Mate, thank you so much for being the guest of our show. I'll say a few words in Romanian and then I'll come back to you to say goodbye.
Thank you.
Recomand cu toată căldura un volum absolut fascinant, Când corpul spune nu. Costul stresului ascuns. E o carte pe care o citiți pe nerăsuflate și aș spune că e o carte obligatorie să înțelegem ceva despre noi. Le mulțumim prietenilor de la editura Curtea Veche pentru mijlocirea acestei întâlniri. Dr. Mate, thank you so much for being the guest of our show. We owe you some fabulous books and good luck with all that you do, and we're looking forward to get your new book. And thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you, and I look forward to being in Romania later on this year. Thank you very much for listening to me. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Tuturor celor care au încredere în Garantat 100%, mulțumim frumos pentru lucrul ăsta. Ne revedem la primăvară într-un nou sezon de emisiuni în premieră. Să fiți sănătoși. Noapte bună!